Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third and final panel. This one on the future of England and the UK in the world. So here we're looking forward in terms of where the UK may be heading, in terms of its integration, disintegration, and also obviously now, given the impending election next month, where the next government may take England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the UK. To speak today we have three speakers. Unfortunately, Evie Aspinall from the British Foreign Policy Group couldn't make it because she's fallen unwell, unfortunately. We have with us Jim Gallagher from the University of Glasgow, who also is a former British civil servant based in Edinburgh and in London. Ailsa Henderson from the University of Edinburgh, who, with Richard Wynne-Jones, who unfortunately couldn't make it as well, published the book Englishness, one of the defining text, shall we say, on studying England. And then finally, joining us online is Mike Kenny from the University of Cambridge, who's written extensively on the Anglosphere and also on the governing of England with the British Academy, who also funded this event. We'll run in terms of Jim, Ailsa, and then Mike giving their 10-15 minutes, and then we'll open it up. And then afterwards, we are going to go to the pub down by the canal, okay, in a very English/British tradition. Okay.
So that's 5 minutes each then.
So Jim, over to you to start. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. It's always nice to be here, as I've never been to the Olympic Park before. Unfortunately, I didn't compete in the Olympics last time. I wanted to talk about three things, I think, as usual. The first is this concept of being a stateless nation, which appears in the literature, but generally not in respect of England. The second is I want to misuse one of my favourite English authors, Mr. Thomas Hardy. And the third is I do actually want to go into some current issues in the light of these things. So, I was struck once again by the analogy which Paul used earlier, which was used often about sharing a bed with an elephant. It occurred to me that where Scotland isn't exactly the same place. It shows I'm a Scot, as you can tell. And I realised that most of my career as an official and subsequently has been in the job of elephant management. How to manage the relationships inside the construct that is the UK, or the construct that is Britain, between the smaller nations and England. Because each of the nations in the UK is a stateless nation. They are nations which do not have a corresponding state. It is, of course, an error to think that all states are nations and states equal nations. They're different creatures. States are juridical creatures, they are physical creatures in the sense of having control, and nations are famously imagined communities. What we tend to forget is that England is, at least formally, just as much a stateless nation as is Scotland or Wales. Difference is, of course, that it's the majority shareholder in the state that is Great Britain, the United Kingdom. Choose your label as you think fit. And the question, I guess, is the first aspect of England's international relations are actually the relations between it and the other nations inside this envelope. And it's quite instructive just to reflect on those, first of all, and think about English foreign policy. And historically, one can see probably three trends or three aspects that pop up. The first one is indifference. It goes back to well, who are we anyway? Are we British? Are we England? Are we Britain? Are we the United Kingdom? And for the most part, for most of the time, most of England, and most of elite England too, is indifferent to what the Scots and the Welsh, and indeed to, in a different way, the Irish get up to. They get on with their lives, they do their own thing. And that indifference shades positively, often into tolerance, provided the other nations don't do things that seriously inconvenience the English. the English have actually been remarkably tolerant of stuff that they could have been resentful of. One might think of the famous West Lothian question, which we got surfaced earlier, to which there is no answer, other than stop asking the question. Or one might think of the my own favourite special subject, the Barnett formula, which is very generous to some parts of the United Kingdom and less generous to others. But occasionally, the tolerance and the indifference does spill over into a degree of irritation and can be made to do so, usually for reasons unconnected with the territorial constitution. Those of us who, as I did, work for the last Labour government, were witnesses to the conscious and deliberate use of Gordon Brown's Scottish identity as a way of delegitimising him as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that's never really wholly gone away. The interesting thing in that, as I'm going to go on to consider, is the extent to which the use of identity politics and the use of constitutional oddities is not for their own sake, actually, but for other political ends. And we'll see a bit more of that, I think, in what I've got to say later. As a result, it's not clear that there are going to be substantially different English as opposed to British foreign policy, like as we heard most foreign folk think, well, there's not much difference between the two. It's worth asking, however, if there are any different interests between the sub-nations of the UK. And the answer to that is not very much, actually. Historically, we used to have fun and games about fish, because the Scots had more sea than the English, and had trouble with the EU in getting their fish quota. So that was a minor divergence, which became quite political. And whether, as we saw earlier, there are distinctions in attitudes. And I'm going to assert that there aren't actually distinctions in attitudes, despite what the data says. Because what we see in the data is that you are seeing an outgrowth of the North-South question on the island of Britain, and not an outgrowth of the Scottish English or the English-Welsh question. Because the attitudinal differences between the Celtic French and the northern parts of England are almost absent. And indeed, they share the same resentments of London, both political, because of political centralisation, and economic, because of economic centralisation, which is the UK's biggest problem. So actually, it seems to me that the principal foreign policy issues, foreign policy implications of the UK's crazy constitution are partly presentational. Oh, you mustn't forget the Scots and the Welsh, etc. You mustn't forget the English have a different view, and quite often structural. And that takes us to the question of how a central UK government can be both the government of England and the government of the UK, and it always confuses the two roles. And we've seen that in spades in the present departing administration over things like the Internal Market Act post-Brexit, and I suspect that we will see it in perhaps a slightly less powerful suit in the incoming Labour government, because it has not had to grapple with Scottish issues internally in the party at the centre, because there have been no Scottish MPs. And that will change, obviously, as we now see. So that's the implications of being a stateless nation, and they're not as substantial as you might think. The second thing I want to mention is Thomas Hardy. You're all Thomas Hardy fans, I hope. I am, certainly, but I particularly enjoyed the return of the native. And of course, what we've got in politics at the moment is the return of nativism. It's all round us. It's in Europe, big time at the moment. We've just seen that in the European elections. My God, it's big in America and getting bigger. And we have our own domestic variety in Mr. Farage and the Reform Party. And what I think is interesting here about nativism as a phenomenon is that typically, apart from some, well, let's say enthusiasts, or I might say deluded people, nativism is not an end in itself. People don't say, I wish to be Scottish, I wish to be British, I wish to be American, just to be American or Scottish or British. It's because they have a particular view of Americanism, of Englishness, of Scottishness, that being native, having control, will enable them to give effect to. And hence nativism appearing, as we, I think, heard earlier, in the agenda of all these rather worrying far-right movements are popping up. And Mr. Farage, I'm afraid, is an example of that. It's clinging on to nativism in order, as a way in to producing a different set of policies than the ones that are even the Conservative government will do. And nativism has one other common characteristic. First of all, it's not an end in itself, and secondly, it's driven by non-identity questions. Nativism is driven essentially by economic and social resentments. Right? If your economy goes flat for a decade, don't be surprised if people are grumpy and they are available to be recruited into this kind of project. And what's interesting here, I think, is that we saw it in Brexit. Brexit was an opportunity to blame Brussels for London's failings, particularly in the north of England. It's unravelling gradually now because Brexit wasn't a solution, it was an additional problem. And it's an interesting question whether Scotland is on a different trajectory in one sense, in that it saw nativism as a way to become, it alleged, more socially just and more likely to be civically nationalist. But that project rather ran into the buffers, and it's not clear where Scottish nationalism will go next. So, a worrying issue here is that for a new government, and I want now to come on to talk about them, that dissatisfaction most certainly remains. Right? Even if the new government does extremely well in the first 100 days or whatever it might be, people's economic and social dissatisfaction will be very difficult to fix because there aren't the resources available. The outworking of a decade of no growth takes years to fix. No doubt about that. So the new government will face threats from nativism. It will face the threats internally in England, in the person of Mr. Farage, who will pretty likely be in Parliament and is a darling of the media, particularly the right-wing media, but not only them, because he's good copy, whatever else he might be. And the answer to that, in my view, and I think is an answer which the Labour government will probably start to take, though not with the enthusiasm I would like, is not to address it head-on, but to address it sideways, and to address it by the decentralisation of power in England. The answer to Nigel is mayors. More of them, bigger ones. Two reasons for that. One, it changes the political discourse to be about what's happening in Manchester, what's happening in Newcastle. Second, it addresses the gap in English governance and the distrust of the centre, which is unusually high, absurdly high, and perhaps deservedly high, but much worse than any other developed countries. And it addresses the underlying political dissatisfaction. And if the mayors have the right power and do a good job, it will help address the economic dissatisfaction. So that's the first outworking of nativism in the new government's agenda. The second one takes us to Scotland, inevitably. It's interesting, there's a kind of supertanker feeling about academic discussions I always find. And goodness me, we've been talking for a decade or more. What happens if Scotland becomes independent? It's not going to. Right? It's not on the agenda for the next decade. So planning for that probably doesn't make much sense. And that's not to say that the Scottish National Party will not be back as an electoral force. What it is to say is that none of us really understands why it is that half the Scottish population are prepared to tick the box saying I support independence, when they know it's not on the agenda. They know it's not going to happen. It's a theoretical possibility for which they can sign up. We don't really know what they're saying to us, and we don't really have an answer to whatever question it is that makes them reply in that way. My own view is that there's a structural UK constitutional answer, and it's all set out in a report done for the Labour Party more than a year ago. I fear that the present Labour Party and the incoming government are not going to buy that. Wait till tomorrow till you see the manifesto, but it will not be radical enough, I fear, for the likes of me. And that issue will bubble up maybe sooner than you think. Electorates are volatile. A couple of years of dissatisfaction under Labour, one could easily see a pop-up of the SNP again, and the UK government will find themselves having to deal with that in 2 years' time, 3 years' time perhaps. But the one that is going to bite us all is Ireland. We forget that we've done this extraordinary confused deal with the EU, the border that isn't a border, the sausages that can or can't cross it, and Europe will change. Europe will, we are a third country, as we heard earlier. We're a third country whose interests they're not committed to. They're just rightly committed to their own interest, and we will find very swiftly that there's an agenda that Europe and Britain have to work together on to try and manage our relationship. And what we're about to find is that Northern Ireland is full of veto players who can stop things. It's the one word that everybody in Northern Ireland knows is no. You don't say no to anything. And given the system, the so-called cross-community votes and so on, there are high probabilities, in my view, that the UK government will find itself on EU-style foreign policy issues having to override the devolved government of Northern Ireland with unpredictable consequences. So that's the one that's really going to come out and bite a new government. And it's always a shame in a talk like this not to have talked about Wales. Wales is always the forgotten part of this, and when one talks about Scottish independence and talks about England, forget that there would be a rump Britain called England and Wales. Wales may in the end be the more interesting one, because it might yet manage to create a relationship in which is more constructive between Wales and England under a Labour government in both places. And that at least is an opportunity for a new administration rather than just a threat.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. So if you want to put your slides up.
Shall I? Well, can I?
Yes.
Can I just stand at the?
Sorry, Mike. We're just going to.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's nice to escape from Scotland, and it's nice to get away from talking about voting in Scotland, because I run the Scottish election study. It also feels very much like a small world, because I am an alumna of the University of Gallagher, where Surgeon now teaches, and longer ago than I think either of us would like to count, Ben Wellings and I were postgraduate students in a theories of nationalism course taught by wonderful Tom Nairn. So it's nice to see something on a basis here. Right, so I want to make a pitch that to understand England, you need to evaluate it in its context, you need to evaluate it over time, and you need to evaluate it alongside its neighbours. And only in so doing can we really understand what is part of a British political culture issue and what is part of a uniquely English political culture issue. And for that, I would argue that you need independently drawn samples from the 4 different parts of the UK. You need comparable questions, and that, having done that, first in terms of quoting the Future of England survey, which has been running since 2011, one of the first reports of which is down there, but then since 2018, running the State of the Union survey, which kind of wraps itself around the Future of England survey and provides parallel surveys in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It helps us to come up with a number of key findings or first principles. And I want to list a couple of them before I jump into the data today. The first is that I believe this is, and we can talk about it afterwards in the question and answer, but I believe this is fundamentally a question of political culture. I believe, second, that the United Kingdom is a multi-level plurinational state, and it must be studied as such, with all of the demands that then means in terms of how we treat certain concepts, but also how we treat the infrastructure for how we understand the state. I would argue that Britishness needs to be tested to see whether it is a concept that operates similarly across the UK or even across Britain. It should not just assumed to be so, and you should never ever take British-wide data and put a British national identity variable in there without first checking to see whether Britishness works the same way across England and Scotland and Wales. I would make the case that English national identifiers are not necessarily English nationalists, but British nationalists, that the British in England are not necessarily British nationalists, but the British outside England most definitely are. And part of this stems from the portrayals of national trajectories. We have Miroslav Kroc in mind, this notion of a nation's glorious past, its fallen present, its possible glorious future. These are used, including in England, as a way to explain various political and economic realities that the UK government has not wanted to confront, including but not limited to devolution. I would argue that devolution and institutional completeness of political debate outside of England help to explain some of the variations that we see. And a key message I would say is that there are aggregate similarities, so I very much agree with Jim here, but that there are different drivers sometimes of the different attitudes, and that reflects differences in political culture. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk a little bit about attitudes in England to the rest of the world, comparing England to other parts, sometimes other parts of Britain, sometimes other parts of the UK, and then look at the relationship between attitudes to external relations and attitudes to the Union and vice versa, and then some of the challenges that flow from that. But first of all, just to get a sense of what the salience is of external relations. So one way we have asked about this for the past 15 years almost is, which of these following issues can you give us the top 3 issues that are a matter of importance to you? These are the most recent data from 2023, which were funded by the Welsh Constitution Commission. And we can see that the most popular issue is support for the relationship with Europe. What has changed is who is paying attention to Europe. It used to be the case that if you were asking people what issue was most important, it was lead supporters who were most likely to say that we have to pay attention to the UK's relationship with Europe. It is now Remain voters who say that we have to pay attention to the UK's relationship with Europe. If we park Europe and then we look at other issues, then the domestic union matters. But which part of the domestic union matters depends very much on where you are. So Scots think the relationship with Scotland is important. In Northern Ireland, they think the future of Northern Ireland is important. Slightly lower figures in terms of English governance. And then you come on to issues like proportional representation and Lord's reform. So that helps to just set the scene in terms of where we are with salience. We also created a Euroscepticism battery because part of our argument was that we don't fundamentally see very different attitudes in England and Scotland, for example. We have similar levels of Euroscepticism, but it's just that the English electorate and the Scottish electorate come to different conclusions at the ballot box. So I've listed here the questions that are part of that Euroscepticism battery, and these are the most recent data from 2023. We see similar trends across all 3 places. Nobody's really convinced about the argument that because the UK has a special relationship with the US, that the EU relations aren't really important. And if we look at some of the positive features, such as we have benefited greatly from being part of the EU, it helps to guarantee freedom of democracy, and we have a great deal in common, and human rights, we have these positive statements. We have broad levels of agreement in England, far more so than agreement with the negative statements. Except perhaps the one about migration being too easy. In fact, you might look at these figures and think, well, how on earth did the English electorate even vote Leave if this is how they view the European Union? Well, the reason, in part, is because of the changes in attitudes that we see since 2014. So if we look at the positive statements, we find that the British electorates have become more positive, more supportive of the positive statements, and less supportive of the negative statements. In fact, for two of the positive and two of the negatives, we are seeing more than a 20-point jump in attitudes since 2014 when we first asked this question. So that's in terms of attitudes to Europe as a whole. Another way we can look at it is in terms of continued links after we leave the European Union. Now, we have been asking for a very long time about support for policy uniformity, this notion that policy should be the same, regardless of devolution, policy should be the same throughout the UK. And there are remarkable levels of support for the notion of policy uniformity. This is slightly less likely to be the case in Scotland, but very strong support in England, which is red, and Wales, which is green. And this might seem a bit incongruous, given that policy variation is an automatic consequence of devolution, but not perhaps as unusual as the fact that if we ask people, well, how much policy uniformity should there be between the UK after it's left the EU and the EU, the body that it has left? And in fact, we see sustained agreement, in fact, in many cases, increased levels of agreement for support for policy uniformity between a UK that has left the EU and the EU itself. And you might look at that and think, well, the Scottish figures are perhaps explained by the higher number of Remain supporters in Scotland, and certainly there are more Remain supporters in Scotland. But if we just look at support for policy uniformity between the EU and between the UK and the EU that it has left, it also remains above 50% for areas like mobile phone roaming charges, health insurance, food hygiene, waste control. It only drops for migration, and particularly so for the free movement of unskilled workers. Of course, we can ask about the EU, but another thing we can do is we can ask about support for the Commonwealth. Those who supported Leave often advocated that the UK could pivot post-Brexit to have deeper trade relations with parts of the Anglosphere, particularly parts of the Commonwealth. So we asked people about their attitudes to the Commonwealth. How supportive are they of trade relations with the Commonwealth? It very much depends which part of the Commonwealth you're talking about. So we had a split half experiment, and we said after it leaves the EU, the UK should prioritise trade deals with the Commonwealth, for example, and half the sample got Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, what some people might call formerly the white dominions or parts of the Anglosphere. And other people, we gave the examples of India, Pakistan, and Kenya. And you see a marked decrease in support. This is just the English electorate, where we asked this question in 2017. We replicated the question in 2018 across England, Scotland, and Wales, and we see the same thing. We see different levels of support when we're looking at Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, but in each case, we see a drop from one formulation of the Commonwealth to another. And you might ask yourself, well, who's more likely to be affected by these different formulations of the Commonwealth? I've picked out here different demographic groups or socioeconomic groups, demographic groups, to see who responds most to the framing, who has the biggest gap between a Commonwealth as conceived in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a Commonwealth of India, Pakistan, and Kenya. And it's largely the Welsh categories here. So older Welsh respondents, those who are conservative in particular parts of Wales, but also bold identity groups here in Wales. Then you get to a cluster in the middle that are largely English demographic groups, and then the Scottish categories tend to be over at the very end. The two groups least affected by the framing in terms of support for the Commonwealth are English Labour supporters and those in the sample who describe themselves as Scottish, not British. We're these really quickly back. After Brexit, we did suggest that there might be some strains on the union, and we wanted to get a sense of how committed people were to the union and whether there were any aspects of the union that they thought could be sacrificed in order to achieve Brexit. And the first time we asked the question, we just said, is this worth it or is it not worth it? But particularly in the case of Scottish independence, we know that we actually have to allow for the option of what's got nothing to do with Brexit. I want it anyway. So the first thing to note from here is that if you ask people whether Scottish independence is worth happening in order to achieve Brexit, then you're only over 50% of the electorate in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. If you combine those who want it anyway, in green, and those who don't want it but believe that having it is worth it in order to achieve independence. Those figures on average jump to in excess of 60% if you're looking just at Leave supporters, and that's particularly the case in England and Wales if you're looking at Welsh Leave supporters, where almost 80% believe that Scottish independence is worth having in order to achieve Brexit. If we ask that the over 50% and over 80%, then if we ask about Irish unification, we see similar patterns, although we have an increase here in a proportion who are willing to see it outright rather than just willing to put up with it as a consequence of Brexit. The same is true in a previous formulation of this question when we asked about disruption of the peace process in Northern Ireland. What's different from the previous one is among Remainers, the sheer number of people who want it outright. But if we're looking at Leavers, that's not the case. It's the number of people not who want it outright, but who believe that it's worth it in order to achieve Brexit. The same is true of the Irish Sea border, similar features here, but in fact, it's here the people who believe that it's worth it to achieve Brexit. Very few people want that Irish Sea border outright. And we can also turn to a question about the breakup of the UK. This is one we haven't asked for a while. We haven't asked that one since 2019, but I put it in there. And we can talk afterwards about whether people thought that this was a likely outcome and whether that affected them, whether they said that they were willing to put up with it. So we get a sense here that certain aspects of the external union might have reflected conditional attitudes to support for the internal union. Another way to look at it, though, is how our attitudes to the internal union might structure our view of external relations. Here are two formulations that we asked in 2014. What happens if Scotland votes yes? And this was conducted before the 2014 referendum in September. So one statement was, if Scotland votes yes, UK's standing will be diminished. And then another one was, what happens if Scotland votes yes? And we put the statement to people, the rest of the UK should support Scotland in applying to join international organizations like the EU and NATO. Now, if we're looking at the diminished figure, we're at around a third of the electorates in England, Scotland, and Wales who believe that the UK's standing will be diminished. And it's in that low level of agreement isn't because there is a considerable proportion of people disagreeing with that statement. It's largely because so many people think neither, or are adding in, if you add in the don't knows, you've got a kind of ambivalent response to that question. That's not the case when it comes to helping Scotland facilitate its way forward in the world as a newly independent state. There you do have higher levels of disagreement. This is part of a series of questions we asked about how we should treat a possible independent Scotland. And so negative were attitudes outside Scotland. I started to refer to it as the punitive departure battery, because attitudes were so unsupportive about how we should treat an independent Scotland. Now, I said I would talk about challenges, and I think this is an important thing to come on to. The findings so far, they're all very interesting, but they're just largely just descriptive, and we have some breakdowns by Brexit vote. But I think the single biggest challenge in navigating this field is the different way that different identity groups react to some of these issues, and particularly the fact that British identifiers throughout the UK don't want the same things, they don't hold the same values, and they don't view the state in the same way. Now, we're used to seeing some manifestations of this. So this is from a regional studies article that my colleagues and I generated with British election study data. And this is just the 0 to 10 identity scale converted into a relative territorial identity scale, where this is at the British, not Scottish, English, Welsh end of things. And that's the English, Scottish, Welsh, not British end of things. And one thing you can see that if you're in Scotland and in Wales, then the support for leave goes down as you get to the sub-state end of identity. But if you're in England, support goes up as you get to the sub-state identity. And that's the relationship that holds, even if we put it into regressions and we control for a whole range of other possible things about your levels of political interest or your awareness or your party ID, your age, your income, your education, and so on, right? Now, so that establishes national identity matters. It helps to tease apart what's going on in terms of Brexit support. And it explains to us that British identity is not working in the same way throughout Britain. And part of the explanation for that is that, and that would also lead you to believe that people who describe themselves as English in England are very much like people who describe themselves as British outside England. And on Brexit, that's true. But if we look at other dimensions of how we might understand the state, our attitude to the external union, Euroscepticism, and also our attitudes to the internal union, or Devo anxiety, and we plot all of these as different identity groups. Here we're just using Moreno because it's easy to tease people apart. Then on the one hand, we can see these are people who describe themselves as English, not British, or English more than British. They are at the Devo-anxious end, and they are also at the Eurosceptic end. But we can compare that to people who describe themselves as British in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and to a certain extent in Wales. They are as Eurosceptic. So again, very consistent with what Jim was saying earlier, but they are much less Devo-anxious. So there are different understandings of the states. And the last substantive slide I have on that is that another way to look at it is to look at it by muscular unionism, which is a term I coined in a Times article and was originally applied not to the Conservative Party, but to the UK Labour Party in terms of its understanding of the state and what we've been calling ambivalent unionism. Ambivalent unionism, I can talk more about that later if you'd like, but if you look at the British identifiers in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland, they are not so high on the ambivalent unionist scale, but they are very high in terms of the muscular unionist scale. This is their understanding. Of the states. If you look at the English identifiers, however, they are less muscular in their understandings of unionism, but they are very much out at the ambivalent unionist state. So one possible question we sometimes use there is, I want independence for my part, I don't want independence for my part, and it's a priority for me that the union remains as it is, or this third ambivalent option, I don't want independence for my part, but if one or more other parts of the UK go the wrong way, then so be it. And that's where the English identifiers are. So by some measures, the English in England look very much like the British outside England. But actually, if you start to look at different understandings of the state, you can actually start to pull them apart a little bit. What does all of that mean? Well, first of all, if we're looking at English attitudes, what's remarkable about English attitudes first is that they're not all that different from attitudes in Scotland. There are similar levels of Euroscepticism. It's just that there are different implications of those attitudes when it comes to the ballot box. We've got continued attention to EU relations. So on salience, they are the same. We also have similar levels of Euroscepticism and similar levels of support for policy uniformity. If we're looking at attitudes to the Commonwealth, it very much depends which part of the Commonwealth you're talking about. If we're looking at attitudes to external relations and how they condition support for the union, then parts of the union are seen as worth sacrificing in order to get your own way on Brexit. And we have replicated the question for Remainers to undo Brexit, and we find similar things. And last, parts of the UK leave, there is really tepid support for facilitating their international journey. The last thing, national identity matters. British identity doesn't operate in the same way throughout the UK. So please, if you're speaking to your fellow students or your colleagues, please reinforce that. By some measures, the English in England and the British outside England might look very similar, but actually, if we start to include other visions of the state, then we can put them apart.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. And first of all, let me just say how sorry I am not to be with you today. I really was hoping to be able to be there, and particularly now that I hear you're all off down the pub, I'm particularly sorry that I can't join you. But I just wanted to offer some remarks which I think actually happily follow quite nicely on from what Jim and Ailsa have been talking about, on to the questions that we've been set. So really two themes I want to explore. One in relation to really these issues about Englishness and English identity and how they frame or spill over into the into attitudes towards foreign policy and how we should think about that. Then I want to talk a bit about devolution more generally and how it has sort of intersected with the foreign policy space. And then I'm going to go to these questions you've set, Tim, about the future and what might be coming down the line. So let me just start with a question which is really prompted in part by Connor and John's paper, which I found very interesting, with which I had a lot of agreement. Really, the question there is there a distinctively English understanding of the UK's role and place in the world? Or, I suppose, I mean, they don't address this directly, but it's a sort of bracketed possibility that should we think also about divergence in attitudes by thinking about differences within national communities, in this case, England. In other words, that the cleavage that we've all become familiar with has been incessantly discussed between the younger, more cosmopolitan graduate populations of cities, particularly cities with high growth rates, where there's more ethnic diversity on the one hand, versus people living in what we might characterize as more hinterland areas, economically post-industrial or coastal towns or rural areas. Now that distinction, as we know, has become very prominent in political science and our discourse, and Brexit is clearly to some degree a proxy for that. It's an imperfect one, but it is undoubtedly related to that. Now, to that meta question, which of these levels should we look when we're trying to understand some of the big differences at the level of public attitudes on foreign policy? I think the answer, I know this sounds a bit mealy-mouthed, but I think it is right, is that both dimensions matter. The internal divide there, which is not unique to England, of course, at all, is clearly important, though I think, as we've found in the last few years, it's easy to caricature it and to overstate it, and also, I guess, to misinterpret it. I mean, those people who posited a permanent realignment where the Conservative Party would forever hold the allegiance to the Red Wall, I think now that looks like a view that is not going to hold up in this election, which is only a few years after those predictions were being made. And undoubtedly, the Conservative Party's success in 29, the coalition he assembled, and also the current appeal of reform, which is partly cause and partly effect of the collapse of the Tory vote, is linked to this underpinning set of views and values on a whole set of questions, but in part about England's position within the UK Union and also its role in the wider world. And, on that, there is a view, and some polling, I think, does bear this up, but there are some important regional differences that you can pick up if you poll at that level. The British Foreign Policy Group did some recent polling, which is quite interesting in that regard. And, the same is true, of course, in other parts of the UK. I mean, some of the polling the Scottish Council of Foreign Affairs did recently, looking at which focused very much on differences between unionists and nationalists in Scotland on foreign policy and international affairs issues. So those divides matter, but we miss some of the really important dynamics behind and influences on attitudes to international questions and foreign policy if we neglect the national, and in this case, the English dimension. Now, I think one reason for that, Ailsa's shown extremely well in her discussion there of the polling, which is that there is an overlap between strong English identification and people who live in some of the people who supported Brexit and people, many of whom lived in some of these hinterland areas. That's not the whole basis of support for Brexit in England, but it's an important part of it. So that's one way of thinking about how these dimensions relate. A different way, which I want to stress, is that I think we really miss something unless we think about the sort of traditions at stake here, those established ideas and feelings of nationhood, and how those in different parts of the UK have shaped ideas, recurrent ideas about the provenance, history, and identity of its different territorial parts, or of its different nations. And these long run and evolving patterns of thinking do undoubtedly shape for some publics views of who should be regarded as trustworthy, who's likely to be an ally, and conversely who's more likely to be an enemy, how people understand international law, the legitimacy of global institutions, and where the UK sphere of influence lies. And they provide a background to, and sometimes quite a powerful constraint on, policy debates in specific areas, such as how we organise and resource our military, and particularly our naval force. So, and this is something Nick Pearce, I know, who spoke earlier, and I are looking at in the context of work we're doing on the kind of recurrence of ideas of the UK as an island state, which very much overhangs policy debates about the role of the Navy and funding for the Navy throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And of course, one ingrained English way of thinking about foreign affairs and the UK's role in the world does reference the idea of the Anglosphere, which I know we discussed earlier, the notion that England, or the UK, but essentially it's an English understanding of Britain, has a special affinity with other English-speaking countries for quite deep historical reasons, an idea that was promoted by Vote Leave during the Brexit referendum, and which overlaps with an older sense of loyalty to the Commonwealth, or the particular understanding of the Commonwealth that I think Ailsa just pointed to in her polling. So, I mean, I think Ailsa's polling there is really interesting, but also in the Englishness book that she did with Richard Wynne-Jones, it is very interesting to see the sort of correlations between English identification and some of these kind of Anglosphere attitudes. So I think understanding these nationally rooted traditions and the imaginaries that they shape is important. And turning to politicians, thinking about both the kind of national differences, having some understanding of those, as well as these internal divisions, is clearly important if they are to have a sense of, public opinion, the limits, the nature of some of the differences within publics in the UK, and also the sort of limits of what people are likely to tolerate in policy terms. Now, obviously, we've got to remember, I mean, so far I focused upon the kind of strong English identifiers, but, there are many people in England, probably about the same number, who do not identify with that heritage, or don't identify strongly with it, and are much more inclined to align with a sense of liberal Britishness, which has framed a more pro-EU set of beliefs and a more liberal multilateral conception of international relations and the UK's role in the world. And that is certainly something that is more aligned with the sort of the liberal left part of the British political spectrum, which of course could become very relevant after the next election. But the point I would make, I mean, I think we all know that there are those differences. We have a sense of that amongst English publics. But I think what is often underplayed is the fact that these differences in outlook are underpinned by a pretty deep set divergence in national identity, in the way in which people feel about their nationhood. And that, it seems to me, makes the job of politicians trying to appeal across these groups, which is what any government that wants to hold the majority has to do in the English context. It makes it that much harder. And I think foreign policy questions have the potential to polarize because of that national identity cleavage. So understanding what lies behind these differences and the values that these different groups of voters tend to hold is not just important, but I think it's actually part of the statecraft that is now needed in relation to foreign policy and defence. And obviously, that's particularly the case in a period like ours, where geopolitical uncertainty and conflict is to the fore. And that the potential to polarize voters which on both national and internal lines, which we've seen sort of very dramatically with an issue like Gaza, is really something now that I think is much more baked into foreign policy management than perhaps has been the case for some while. That's the first issue I wanted to raise. The second is sort of moving beyond England itself. A rather different factor, but I think it also has a bearing upon this question of the challenge of foreign policy management. And that is relating to or arises from the governance landscape, which has been created by successive devolution reforms in different parts of the UK, including now in England. And particularly, though, the establishment of governments in those different parts, which have in different ways entered the foreign policy, international relations space, even though, as we know, foreign policy is formally an issue reserved to the UK Parliament. But in fact, if you look at it, all of these different governments have over time developed some kind of foreign policy footprint. I mean, most notably, that is true in Scotland. And this process is not just a product of the SNP being in government. It has a longer pedigree. Those of you with long memories will remember Jack McConnell's links with Malawi, the formal agreement he made between the governments in 2005, focusing on issues like governance, sustainable economic development, and education. And the SNP in government has pursued this in a more sustained way. It didn't invent this, but I think it has pursued it in a more conscious and sustained way. It's pursued its own international diplomacy on climate change issues very prominently, developed its own independent aid policy, and enlarged its institutional footprint more radically than its Labour predecessor did, opening more international offices and so on. So why? What lies behind this broad trend? I think there are different reasons here, partly fairly obviously because UK decision making in this area, of all areas, has huge implications for devolved governments and policies they want to pursue in devolved areas of competence. As one area, this is one example, I think, of a wider trend where the reserved devolved boundary is beginning to sort of collapse before our eyes, but also fairly obviously as governments and politicians find advantage in promoting themselves on the international stage or building links to and creating profile by association with international actors. And it's interesting to track this even in relation to the English model, the weaker English model. You're beginning to see figures like Andy Burnham and Sadiq Khan do something really quite similar. Now, underpinning all that is fairly obviously because geopolitical issues resonate powerfully with domestic politics and with the audiences that these leaders are trying to reach, and they can provide a fairly ready way for the parties to send signals in terms of their values, and also to establish distance from or criticise the UK government. So there are sort of forms of soft power, as political scientists call it, being exercised here, as well as different kinds of political opportunities being sought. Two quick points to reflect on, I think, or worth emphasising here. One is it is striking, I think, that there is no institutional process for bringing other governments into anything like, not policy making, but in any kind of input or consultation or some sort of stakeholder relationship on a host of foreign policy and security related issues at the British centre. And that's in stark contrast to the intergovernmental system that's been developed, which is mostly focused on areas of devolved competence. And it's interesting that there is growing recognition of the absence of this in the foreign policy space and security space amongst parts of the British establishment. So recently, the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy argued that if UK national security is to be delivered effectively, the government must ensure that the voices of all three devolved administrations are heard within UK decision-making structures. And a recent report you may have seen on the future of the Foreign Office, co-authored by ex-Cabinet Secretary Mark Sedwell, recommended that the future of the Union also requires that devolved nations are involved in the development of the highest priority areas of UK foreign policy. Now, for the most part, this is a fairly quiet, unspectacular dynamic, which is actually, I think, in many ways, the sort of haziness about where the boundary lies between reserved and devolved here is, I think, perfectly compatible with the sort of development of the British system. But there have been, as you will know, sort of points of conflict and tension. There was a recent interesting issue about the Scottish government meeting representatives, I think it was Turkey, without their FCDO minders present, but that's at the sort of milder end of this. I think the potential for sort of more tension in this area is considerable, even if actually the same party is in power in the devolved and central government. Mostly these are minor containable issues, but I mean, we have to, I think, give some consideration to the fact that given the multiplicity of geopolitical conflicts that is apparent, there is a fairly imaginable possibility of, I think, a bigger conflict over, for instance, a devolved leader or government expressing support for a country or cause with which the British government is in conflict or even in military conflict. So, and that kind of, we sort of edged towards that, I think, in some ways with Gaza and particularly the intervention in relation to the Houthis. So there is a potential stress test here, if that were to happen, of our constitutional system, and also politically the potential for quite deep polarization along national and internal lines. More immediately, I think what this has done, which is more important than any of this, is actually make UK foreign policy look and feel much more English, or much more the outcome of English preferences, which of course is in part the product of having a Conservative government for many years, which has relied preponderantly on support of English MPs. And I think this is actually a potential problem for a union state, and exactly the opposite of what the architects of devolution hoped and wanted would happen. The idea being that giving more power, constrained powers, but over domestic affairs, would help citizens and governments in devolved areas consent to the British character of British policy making, which was exactly the same argument that was advanced during the debates about home rule at the beginning of the 20th century. So I think it's very interesting that issue, that this has, there's a sort of potentiality here for real difficulty. And I do note that the Brown Commission report, which Jim was involved with, did say some quite interesting things, I think, about foreign policy and devolution, I presume for this kind of reason. And then just to finish with, Tim, if I may, just looking towards the future horizon and picking up a couple of the questions you've posed so quite directly. So will policy towards the EU be shaped by English views? I mean, to some extent, inevitably so, given the numbers of voters that we're talking about in England compared to other parts of the UK. And also, if the polls are right and the Conservatives do collapse as dramatically in England as it currently looks as if they might be doing, then that clearly gives a weight to English opinion. But whereas I think there is something different about a potential Labour government to the governments that we've had since 2010, and particularly since Brexit, where English views undoubtedly carried particular weight amongst many politicians, and judgments about the views of different groups of English voters on foreign policy, but related issues like immigration undoubtedly have fed into and accentuated some of the deep divisions in the Conservative Party. But Labour, on the other hand, I think is just likely to have a more complicated and maybe ambivalent relationship with English opinion, partly because its core vote is much more inclined towards the Liberal perspective, which I pointed to earlier. And I mean, I think on the EU specifically, whilst there is some evidence of Brexit disappointment amongst former supporters of it, and I was interested in some of the things Ailsa was saying on sort of shifting attitudes in some demographics on this, I think it would really take a very dramatic shift amongst English voters, particularly amongst voters in red wall areas, and a sustained shift of a kind we've not yet seen to prompt a sort of shift in Labour's strategy towards the EU and to sort of want to make this a bigger, more salient issue. And, there's a deeper question here, which, I know we've touched on today, but about Labour's somewhat more nervous relationship, I think, with these groups of English voters. And then the final question, what might the end of the UK mean for the international relations of England and other parts of the UK? I mean, I think God knows is the answer to that. So much would be up in the air in the eventuality of breakup. So I think it's impossible to answer in any kind of precise way. But I just wanted to land on one point, which is this really, which I do, my sense of this, and I think it's a little bit confirmed actually by something that Ailsa just said in her analysis of this recent polling, which I find very interesting, is that one of the things that obsesses British elites about the breakup of the UK is the idea of the loss of great power status and geopolitical standing. And I mean, I do wonder whether that resonates at the popular level as much as politicians often assume. And I think that's as true of England as it is in other parts of the UK. I mean, it is interesting to see that evidence about ambivalence on that question, and that really, I think it was about a third of people who responded to that particular prompt. And that seems to me absolutely right. I mean, I was very struck how much that kind of argument that was when it entered the debate in 2014 did not appear to be one of the factors sort of driving support towards the unionist camp. So I think if that's true, if there is a sort of gap that's opened there between how the British political establishment thinks about the purpose and value of the UK Union from the sort of benefits and values that its citizens hold dear, I think then actually that opens up a very interesting and sort of challenging question really about foreign policy itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Ailsa, Jim, would you like to come to the front, and then we can open this up for questions. Does anybody have any questions to begin with? And I appreciate some of this is very, especially looking ahead, as Mike said, God knows, in terms of where things will go. Anybody have any opening questions? Or do Ailsa, Jim, Mike, do you have anything to say to each other in terms of what you've heard? Oh, is there a question on the chat? Oh, wow, okay. We do have someone online. Is it Kenny? Okay, the question is, it's to Ailsa regarding a sample size. Kenny, I think if you can unmute, so you can probably speak. You're on mute at the moment. We can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
I can comment on sample sizes though. Yeah. So the sample size for 2023 was just over 1,000 in Northern Ireland and comfortably over 1,000. It was about 1,200 in Scotland, Wales, and in England. We have been doing this for many, many years. We never go below 1,000. Really, I think there was 1 year when we were just starting out, and we did 2017 as a trial run in Northern Ireland. Then we were about 900. But for everyone else, we're always well over 1,000. And in some years, when we have more money and my Welsh co-author gets his way, then the sample in Wales swells dramatically because he believes Wales is the most interesting part of the UK to look at, which someone else said earlier. Which Jim said earlier. So yeah, sometimes it's up around 2,500.
I'm hoping, Kenny, that answers your question. If not, if you type your question into the chat feature, and we'll come back to it. Anybody else? Paul?
Yeah, to Jim, you say things can happen faster, particularly disenchantment in Scotland, for example, about the failure of the new government to respond to the priorities that Scots would see for a more effective devolution. But there's a related question about the mayors. How, if the system is as skint as it says it is going to fund the mayors? I mean, in order for the mayors to be got up and running as a real element in a new unionism, do they not need a lot more funding for regional and local governments than is apparent? And thirdly, arising from Mike's question about the breakup, I think John's evidence about the distinct views of elites and ordinary people is really relevant to that. That there's a a mismatch between attitudes. And that mismatch, if it came to another Iraq type of question, as with Blair, could, erupt. That could be a big shock.
So, on the money, yeah, skint is the right word. I think what we're going to find, there's a nice piece in the FT yesterday, I think, by Martin Wolf on this. Don't talk about the money is the whole theme of the general election. And the arithmetic is really quite terrifying. And that constrains it contains three things. Generally speaking, the domestic issue that's at the top of most people's agenda is health, and health is very expensive. It's also really difficult to recruit doctors and nurses and all these other folks in a time. And therefore, I think people are going to be disconcerted by having said, well, we've got rid of these terrible people that were there, and though the day-to-day stuff hasn't changed yet, which is why I think the first couple of years are going to be very difficult for the Labour government. Now, I don't think that is in the end, at a UK level, fatal for the government. I think they'll get a fair amount of sympathy from the population, particularly if they handle it quite well. There has to be a moment in which Rachel Reeves looks shocked at the terrible state of the public finances. I didn't realise it was as bad as this. And there will, that's going to be quite a difficult thing to finish, but one can imagine how it might be done. There are two problems with it, however, from the perspective we were talking about today. The first is that the only scope the Scottish Nationalists now have to come back is to say that the Labour government is just the same as the Tories. And they will say that. They'll say it no matter what, right? Because it's the only thing they can say. But if they're able to say, and the Scottish Health Service hasn't got any better, and there's no money for this or that, they might get leverage, which is why I think there's a risk that at the Scottish end of this, things change more quickly than most people expect. As for the mayors, yes, they could do with some money. I think what's more interesting, more possibility is that what they really need is capital investment for infrastructure. And there is some capital, and there's also potentially the scope for private capital, if we can get the P5 replaced by something that actually works. So they're all right, I think. And my personal view is that they will be part of the solution to most problems at the moment, actually, one way or another. What I don't think is going to be a problem with in the short run is not enough movement and devolution. Because I actually think when you look at what the voters want, they're not actually getting all that interested in board powers on this, and that's very much a no-meat point, and that can probably be met by relatively small changes. What worries me in the medium term is that once the, maybe after longer than 2 years, but once the Labour government has bedded itself in, is making progress, but it's not going fast enough in 3 to 5 years' time, they will not have a strategy to deal with the territorial aspects of their work, which will gradually make their way further to the top. So that's the risk that they manage. I think there was one more question, Paul.
I had a question then about Jim, about John's evidence for Mike's point about the elites and the ordinary attitude.
I suppose that that disjuncture, shall we say, between the elites and the public, or even the point you made about Iraq. Here I turn to everyone else, which is, what data do we have back from the Iraq War, from the days then? Was there any differences that were detected?
Well, people forget that the Scottish Parliament voted in favour of the Iraq War.
Okay.
The Nationalists were against it, but they were a minority at the time.
Yeah.
Mike has his hand up.
Okay. Mike, you have your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just come in on the first of those questions? Just the Paul's question about devolution and sort of investment and resources. I think, what is really notable, there's a sort of paradox here, because in the English case, the main rationale for devolution, stretching right back I suppose you could go much further back to the regional, different attempts to build sort of regional level administration under Labour, and then into the coalition government and into the sort of mayor's combined authority model. I mean, what links all of that is really the belief that this will help with regional economic growth, or indeed this is a precondition for economic growth. And that's the primary driver of why most people, or why more MPs and the British political parties come behind devolution, and particularly start to agree on the current model that we've got, is the sort of belief or hope that this is actually a route to getting a more balanced pattern of regional economic growth. And now there is, if you look at it internationally, as I understand it, the evidence is that devolution can prompt economic growth, or at least create the conditions in which it's more likely to be achieved. But there's a very good recent paper by LSE Andres Rodriguez Poza and his collaborators. I mean, their analysis of the international data says that tends to happen when two other conditions are in place. One is when you basically fund the new devolved authorities so that they can deliver on their responsibilities. And then the other is that there is sufficient capability in place at that level in order to be able to, again, both deliver on the sort of devolved responsibilities you've got, but also to understand the nature of your region and its problems. And it's those latter two bits that are at risk if we do devolution on the cheap. So we may have, because you can do devolution on the cheap, you can do it without necessarily investing heavily up front, but you may be creating the conditions in which failure is almost inevitable. So I think it is a really big issue, and it is a big paradox. But beyond that, and more immediately, the crisis of local government finance in England is just something that Labour will not be able to avoid, and it will hit them very early on.
Thanks, Mike. There is a question for you, Jim. Actually, it's in the chat. It says, Jim says independence is off the table with the SNP for 10 years. Where is evidence and numbers to validate that statement? I think that come from Kenny. Yes.
Thanks. It's a reasonable question. It was an assertion rather than an evidence-based thing. But what's interesting at the moment is the rethinking that's going on inside the independence movement. The more thoughtful ones, and there are plenty actually, are saying the strategy that we had, which was to use devolution as a stepping stone and to use the legal mechanisms of referendum and so on, clearly hasn't worked for us, and it hasn't been working since 2014. And there are a lot of the people in the independence movement saying we need a different strategy. And certainly when one looks at the SNP as a party, as it were, the vehicle for independence demands, it's in a bad way at the moment. It might not be in a bad way in 2 or 3 years' time, but at the moment it's in a very bad way, and its leadership themselves understand that. So it's a relatively confident prediction, Kenny, rather than a guarantee. Maybe you don't want it to be a guarantee, of course. Maybe you'd like it to be the opposite. You'd like it to be completely wrong.
There is data on that though. So I mean, in the Scottish election study, we obviously poll before and after devolved elections, but we poll routinely during the year in our Scoop poll, our Scottish Opinion Monitor poll, and so we've been asking for a very long time, when do people want the next independence referendum? And it's a rolling 5-year window. So if you ask people when do you want it, the most popular answer is always in 5 years. So it's not quite, and it's still a rolling five-year window. Now people don't want it now for different reasons. Some people don't want it now because they think they'll lose. Some people don't want it now because some people on both sides, on the no side and the yes side, don't want it soon because they think it won't give them the outcome that they want. But certainly from a electorate point of view, there is no sense of urgency about a referendum at all. And that's coupled with the data that we do have, where there was a clear alignment between support for independence and support for the SNP from 2011 onwards. But what we've seen, particularly since the 2021 election, is a decoupling of support for independence and support for the SNP. So the support for the SNP and support for the Scottish Government, led by the SNP, so support for the party in terms of vote intention and support for the government it leads, both have been in free fall since 2021, from before Nicola Sturgeon resigned. And certainly everything that's happened since she's gone hasn't helped the party any, and it's continued to go down. But independent support is as sticky as before. But what's changing is we're seeing even less appetite for an urgent referendum.
Just one more point on that. So this is a rabbit hole down which I'm far too happy to go. What this makes me ask is, when people will say they want to be like St Augustine, chaste but not now, and independent but not for at least 5 years, what are they actually saying to us? I mean, do some more polling. You ask them, don't ask them the independence question, ask them the question, who should run?
Yeah.
Subject X or Y. Quite a lot of independence supporters would like to have a common currency, a common army, a common foreign service, and a common old age pension. Well, whatever that is, it's not independence.
Yeah, and that was true in the Quebec data as well,
Yeah,
before
yeah.
1995. Yeah.
John,
Can I make a comment and raise a question? The comment just on the mayors thing, let's take mayors as a cipher for devolution, because there are places that won't probably ever have mayors but need devolution. Where England is at the moment is that mayors have got very large megaphones and very small budgets, and that probably makes them quite an unpredictable factor, not just for the reasons that Mike was talking about earlier on foreign policy issues. So it will be an interesting question if the mayors are utterly dependent on Whitehall discretionary powers and resources. So the really interesting question here is, will mayors lead to something that was talked about in the Brown report, which is actually a legal recognition of the constitutional autonomy of English local government, so in other words, a profound rethinking of how England is governed at that layer. So I'll leave that on the table, but it goes on to things that several people have said throughout today. Part of what's at stake here is how people imagine their nation to be, where it is in the world. One of the things that stands out is that England is the only part of the United Kingdom not to have had that debate in the last 20 years. Right. So it's had to have it by proxy, so it had Brexit. If England clearly doesn't have a single coherent view of its view in the world, which it doesn't, the question I think that poses is, where can England have that discussion? Now, people say, oh, you mean an English Parliament? No, there are lots of ways in which you can bring an English dimension, both into internal government relations within the UK, into the organisation of the civil service, into the way in which Parliament operates. But my question is, do we ever make progress on this without enabling the English public to talk overtly about how it sees itself as England and in relation to the Union and all of the stuff that Ailsa has brought out? Isn't it the case that if England never has that discussion, it will break out repeatedly and possibly quite destructively in quite a number of different ways?
who would like to?
Good. Do you do easy questions as well?
Well, Mike has his hand up there. So.
I was pointing at Jim, actually. I mean, I as you know, John, I have a lot of sympathy for that view. I mean, I suppose we'll say a couple of things. One thing that does matter here is politics and party politics, and to some degree, I think when English opinion moves, as it looks like it will do in the coming election, across these divides that I was talking about, when it moves behind one British party and that party wins overwhelmingly, I mean, in a sense, that is the English expressing the weight of their opinion in a very direct political way. That doesn't, I accept, address the sort of fundamental point that you're making there, but it certainly, as Brexit did, does allow people to feel that they can call the shots to some extent. But I mean, I think you're right that there isn't, it's the sort of missing, one of the missing pieces in the UK system, and essentially, if you look back over the last 10, 20 years, when different politicians have aired that view and have tiptoed towards it, or some people have grabbed the English Parliament idea, but obviously evil was to an extent a sort of way of, I think, edging towards that kind of question, but was, the way it was set up, it was never going to really give that kind of answer, this sort of answer. Means that we're out, there doesn't feel like there's anything in it for any political actor at the moment. I mean, I'm slightly pessimistic on this. I tend to think that there will be a forcing crisis, which will just will actually bring that question to the fore. And the most likely one, I think, following, I suppose, the train of Jim's thought, is it would actually be Northern Ireland, I think, departing the UK. That might well be the kind of moment which would force that sort of issue on the table, because then our UK is just whatever that the name would then be, it just looks like a very unusual entity, and you can't then avoid questions about territorial relationships with England in particular, being more conscious of where it sits within this entity.
Right, add some things to that. I agree with most of what Mike said there. Though first of all, on the last point, actually it seems to me that the putative departure of Northern Ireland, which would be, as it were, a pass of a ball from one state to another, it would not be an independence. It would be a very careful. Ming vases have been in fashion as metaphors lately. This is the Ming vase to deal with all Ming vases, and I think as it were, it's not secession, but the handover from one state to another part of our territory feels rather different from a departure, say, of Scotland would have been, which is a different story. And therefore I suspect that what's left of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Wales, and it's called Great Britain, is actually a simpler state, and one which is easier to manage in many ways. But coming back to your point, John, about England and Englishness, I think you might be right to say we've tried various structural solutions, and an English Parliament was never going to work, and is not going to happen. We had a go at evil, and I was a big proponent, as Mike knows, that let's do something symbolic in the form of evil. I suspect that the answer in England is going to prove to be outside of the constitutional space and in some kind of cultural representational political way. And Boris Johnson was, God help us, quintessentially one sort of English person. It's sort of this sub-Woodhouseian personality. Maybe there's an equivalent political person. I don't think it's Keir Starmer, to be honest. There might be such a person. Structurally, you could facilitate that by a deputy prime minister, chairing the English cabinet committee, or whatever it might be. There's certainly stuff you could do there. And a point on the mayors, if I may. My goodness, yeah, they're thin, right? They don't have much. They can get more, and it would be great if we eventually embedded a subsidiarity principle. I don't think it's going to be in the Labour manifesto, I'm sorry to say. But the lesson of devolution, which we often forget, is that people want to be represented. They actually want to be the same as the other people. Your data shows very clearly. Often people don't really want variation, they want representation, and mayors will provide that, and therefore I'm all for megaphones.
Could I just add one more point to what Jim just said, actually, and just as to take what you just said there, Jim, one step further, perhaps in answer to John. I mean, if I think the Conservative Party have committed to devolution everywhere in England by 2030, I mean, that may not matter given the outcome of the election. Let's see what Labour commit to. I suspect they will set some sort of target. If they do move ahead on that front, then I think the question of, what is the name for a collectivity of mayors? We will have pretty, elected leaders at that intermediate level right across England. I mean, does then that become potentially, anyway, some kind of, does it begin to sort of provide something the sort of thing that you're talking about, a collection of English leaders who could be gathered together in all sorts of ways and could be given some kind of quasi-constitutional role. I mean, it wouldn't happen fast, and it may not happen at all, but it does introduce a new ingredient within our sort of territorial system, which, if it works and if it gets legs and if the mayoral idea really does embed, I think has some kind of potential in the space you're talking about.
Can I chip something in? It's a shameless self-promotion, but as a co-organiser, I'd draw your attention to a proposal and draft bill that David Lidington, the former Deputy Prime Minister, and myself published 2 weeks ago, where we actually say as part of that you should have a statutory body to represent English local government, which effectively would be made up of combined local authorities from across England and the Mayor of London, because then you actually have a legal and quasi-constitutional element. So rather than mayors dealing individually with central government, the collectivity of mayors or combined local authorities actually works with central government on policy. I think there are things like that could be done that begin to introduce this English element. I'll now stop talking about my own work. But
Thank you, John. Conscious of time, so Ailsa, final word is for you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we know there are three things going on. We know that if we look at the attitudes in England, there are strong local identities. We know that there is a strong desire for subsidiarity, and we know that England is excessively centralised. And so the mayors, however funded, the mayors are a way to address that. They respond to strong local identities, and they respond to a demand for subsidiarity. But the third thing we know is present in the attitudes is a desire to have an English political space. And if you ask people about the range of options that they want, and you put English in front of things, it always is more popular than some sort of sub-state option. And if that's true, if you ask them to evaluate all the options separately, it's true if you force them to choose one from a list, and it's also true if you force them to choose between a solution that treats England as a single political unit and a solution that carves England up into different sized entities. And that's true in England of people who describe themselves as English, so English national identifiers, but that preference is also there for people who describe themselves as British. So the only thing that concerns me about the mayors is that it solves one of the problems but not both of them. And I think it will leave unmet a demand for some sort of an English space. Now, there's different ways to go about it. The reintroduction of evil remains by far the most popular option. It has always been the most popular option. We will park the fact that people didn't notice it when it was introduced, and when told it happened, didn't think it went far enough. So there are complications around evil. But the other is that it requires the UK government to be forthcoming about when it is acting for England and when it is acting for the whole of the UK. And so there's a role here also for the UK government to change its behaviour and its naming policies, and it's a language around how it speaks of England as a unique political space. And that could also go some way to addressing that untapped demand, unmet demand.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers, to Ailsa, Jim, and Mike. Thank you, John, for working with me to set this up, and thank you all for coming along today. I will be editing and putting up the videos of each panel, and John and I will be in touch about what we're going to do in terms of our own work and further publications. Thank you, everyone. We'll now head to the pub if you want to join us. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.